بسم رب شهداء و صدیقین. آقای رئیس
إعلان مهم.
重要提示
Important announcement.
Message important.
Важное объявление.
Annuncio importante.
يرجى من المتحدثين الكرام إلقاء بياناتهم بسرعة معقولة لضمان ترجمة فورية وافية وعالية الجودة.
为了帮助口译准确完整传递发言信息，请代表发言时语速不要过快。
Speakers are kindly reminded to deliver their statements at a reasonable pace to ensure complete and quality interpretation.
Il est rappelé aux orateurs qu'ils doivent présenter leur déclaration à un rythme raisonnable afin de garantir une interprétation complète et de qualité.
Напоминаем ораторам, что для того, чтобы устный перевод был полным и качественным, необходимо выступать в умеренном темпе.
Se ruega a los oradores que pronuncien sus declaraciones a un ritmo razonable para garantizar una interpretación íntegra y de calidad.
Excellencies, distinguished participants, Colleagues, I hereby declare open the 49th meeting of the 61st session of the Human Rights Council. We will now turn to the urgent debate of today. As per usual practice, let me begin with a few practical details. On 23 of March, I received a letter from the permanent representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran to the United Nations office in Geneva on behalf of the government of the Islamic Republic of Iran, China, and Cuba, requesting the convening of an urgent debate during the ongoing 61st session on the protection of children and educational institutions in international armed conflicts, the aerial attacks on Shajare Tayyebe Girls' School in Minab, Iran, as a grave breach of international humanitarian law and international human rights law. As decided by the Council during its 45th meeting on Wednesday, 25th March, we shall now proceed with this urgent debate. The urgent debate will follow the same format as a general debate of this Human Rights Council and will follow the time-saving measures adopted by the Council on 9 February 2026. Speaking time will therefore be limited to 1 minute and 30 seconds for everyone. The list of speakers will close in 15 minutes. I now give the floor to Mr. Volker Turk, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, for his statement by video. He has the floor.
Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, the bombing of Shajare Tayyebe Elementary School in Minab evoked a visceral horror. The images of bombed-out classrooms and grieving parents showed clearly who pays the highest price for war. Civilians with no power in the decisions that led to conflict. In this case, a reported 168 pupils, teachers, school staff, and their loved ones. I send my deepest condolences to the bereaved families. Whatever differences countries have, we can all agree they will not be solved by killing school children. That is why we have the laws of war to protect children and other civilians caught up in conflict, as well as schools and all civilian infrastructure. In the case of this school, the onus is on those who carried out the attack to investigate it promptly, impartially, transparently, and thoroughly, to determine the facts and lay the basis for accountability. Senior US officials have said the strike is under investigation. I call for that process to be concluded as soon as possible and for its findings to be made public. There must be justice for the terrible harm done. It is gravely concerning that around the world, attacks on schools are increasing. In 2024, such attacks surged by a shocking 44%, leaving 52 million children out of the classroom. I call on all countries to take urgent steps to protect educational facilities and those who study and work in them. Mr. President, resort to the use of force at a time when negotiations were ongoing is a strategic failure that has had a devastating impact on civilians. Bombs and missiles are not the path towards sustainable peace. They bring death, destruction, and misery, in many cases only deepening grievances and fueling future violence. In Iran, as the conflict has progressed, US and Israeli attacks have increasingly struck densely populated residential areas and destroyed civilian infrastructure. Homes, medical facilities, schools, courts, transport networks, and energy installations have been hit across all 31 provinces of the country. According to the Iranian authorities, more than 1,900 civilians have been killed and tens of thousands injured. The targeting of nuclear facilities is reckless beyond comprehension. These attacks raise serious concerns over compliance with international humanitarian and human rights law, under which the protection of civilians must remain central. Mr. President, the people of Iran are caught between conflict and repression. I'm gravely concerned by reports that since the start of the hostilities, the Iranian authorities have intensified their crackdown on civic space. Law enforcement authorities have repeatedly said that dissent will be treated as collaboration with the enemy and punished harshly for acts including filming damaged sites or communicating about the conflict. The authorities have intensified arrests, judicial cases, and bans against people and media outlets accused of promoting so-called enemy narratives. We have reason to believe hundreds of people have been arrested, while journalists, activists, and public figures have been placed under surveillance. The internet has been shut down for nearly a month. War does not reduce the responsibility of the Iranian authorities to abide by their human rights obligations. Mr. President, the military escalation in the Middle East and the Gulf is reaching dangerous levels. It must end. There is a high and rising risk of further contagion and increased civilian suffering in the countries directly involved. Beyond the region, there are fears of grave economic consequences, from deepening poverty and hunger to shortages of medicine and fuel. It is imperative that all parties halt the escalation. I call on the United States and Israel to end their attacks against Iran, and I call on Iran to stop attacking its neighbors and to respect and protect the human rights of its own people. I urge restraint on all sides and implore the parties to conflict to return to negotiations, the only path towards a durable solution to their differences. Divisions within this Council must not distract us from a shared focus on the human rights of people across the Gulf and the Middle East. As I address you for a second time in 3 days, I urge all states to prioritize preventing further suffering, protecting all civilians regardless of nationality or location, and seeking long-term sustainable peace. Thank you.
I thank the High Commissioner. And I now give the floor to Ms. Farida Shahid, the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Education, who will deliver a statement on behalf of the Coordination Committee of Special Procedures by video. She has the floor.
Mr. President, Excellencies, and distinguished delegates, today I address you in my capacity as the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Education and on behalf of the Special Procedures Coordination Committee. The Special Procedures have been closely monitoring the rapid escalation of hostilities during the military offensive of the United States of America and Israel against Iran. In our statement earlier this month, we strongly condemned the strike on the elementary school in Minha. On 28 February, U.S. Tomahawk missiles struck the elementary school around 10:45 a.m. local time as classes were underway. At least 175 people were killed, mostly children aged 7 to 12. Large parts of the schools were reduced to rubble, families torn apart and devastated. I reiterate what we said in our statement. A strike on a school is a grave assault on children, on education, and the future of an entire community. International humanitarian law is crystal clear. Attacks directed against civilians or civilian objects, or which fail to adequately distinguish between military objectives and civilian infrastructure, constitute serious violations of international humanitarian law and may amount to war crimes. This is not an isolated incident. According to various reports, over 600 schools and educational facilities have already been destroyed or severely damaged, and over 230 children and teachers killed. The strike on the school is just one consequence of this war. Over 1,000 civilians have been killed, 3 million people displaced, hospitals and World Heritage sites destroyed in Iran, while striking oil infrastructure risks serious long-term health effects in the region. Mr. President, I'm a mother. I know what it means to carry a child and bring them into the world. As parents, we watch them grow with tears and fears and sleepless nights and sheer joy when they learn and laugh, discover and grow. There's no bigger pain for any parent than to lose a child, an unimaginable rupture of life. Excellencies, on behalf of all the world's parents, I ask, who exactly will be held responsible for these deaths? Surely we cannot allow the lives of these and other children to be extinguished without consequences. Mr. President, schools are civilian objects and children are expressly protected under international humanitarian law and the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Directing attacks against civilian objects unless they become military objects is prohibited under treaty and customary international humanitarian law. Indiscriminate attacks are strictly prohibited. Intentional attacks on educational buildings that are not military objectives are war crimes listed in the Rome Statute under Article 8. But what does this really mean in terms of liability? Ultimately, the responsibility lies with the state that carried out the attack on the school to conduct thorough, prompt, and impartial investigations into this attack and all attacks on civilian objects. Preliminary investigation by the U.S. military has concluded that American forces were responsible for the missile strike. The school and other buildings in the compound were each struck individually by precision munition, meaning that U.S. military clearly intended to strike the school. Ongoing investigation suggests that the school attack might have been a result of a mistaken targeting by the U.S. military using outdated intelligence. If officially confirmed, this would mean that the principle of taking feasible precautions in attacks was most likely violated. In particular, the rule that a party to the conflict must do everything feasible to verify that targets pursued are in fact military objectives. If journalists and civil society groups using only open source access could relatively quickly establish that the school was separated from the wider compound and visibly marked, the U.S. military, with all the tools at its disposal, surely could have done so prior to the attack. They had an obligation to do so. The question is why outdated information was used. Who failed to verify the data? Who exactly in the chain of command was responsible for verification, and what liability under domestic and international law will the person or persons face in the end? The families of the victims deserve a transparent and authoritative account of what happened, as well as justice and accountability. Mr. President, we mandate holders appointed by the Human Rights Council stress the importance of accountability. All violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law must be investigated and those responsible held to account. We welcome the independent international fact-finding mission on the Islamic Republic of Iran regarding ongoing violations, including the attack on the Menab school. It's vital that the fact-finding mission carry out its mandate fully without obstruction. We also welcome the Secretary General's annual report on children and armed conflict as a form of accountability, since its annex lists parties to conflict which have attacked schools, which are considered one of 6 grave violations against children. State responsibility in the form of reparation, restitution, and rehabilitation for internationally wrongful acts is another important channel. This may include rebuilding schools, trauma-informed education, and supporting the reintegration of affected children into education. My 2025 report on the right to education in armed conflict argues that education itself can be a form of reparation for children who survived the horrors of war. Excellencies, this tragic incident must not fall into an accountability gap. Every possible avenue for accountability must be explored, and if the existing framework falls short of holding the responsible party to account, the priority must be creating a stronger framework. This is a matter of justice. Parents and children around the world need assurance that such violations will not be repeated. There must be no impunity for countries and decision makers who permit attacks on children. In concluding, I stress that the right to education remains fully applicable during armed conflict, protected under both international human rights law and international humanitarian law, which have mutually reinforcing and complementary roles. The right to education is a life-saving right. In crisis, education gives children a supportive environment, a sense of normalcy, psychosocial support, and pathways to recovery. Protecting education is both a legal obligation and investment in peace. Therefore, education must be treated as a core humanitarian priority alongside food, water, shelter, and healthcare. While this urgent debate focuses on the school attack in Minhab, the human cost of this conflict extends across the region. The protection of all civilians on all sides of this conflict must remain the central priority. All efforts must be directed towards preventing further harm ensuring access to essential services, and safeguarding the dignity and rights of all affected populations. The world needs peaceful coexistence where communities can live without fear and children grow up safely. We call for an immediate end to hostilities and urge all parties to fully respect their obligations under international humanitarian law to protect civilians and to provide justice and effective redress for victims. The special procedures stand ready to support the Council and all relevant actors in addressing the human rights implications of this crisis, promoting accountability, and advancing efforts towards de-escalation and lasting peace. Finally, our thoughts are with the families of the victims and the survivors who now face unimaginable trauma. The killing of children can never, ever be justified. Thank you.
I thank the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Education, who spoke on behalf of the Coordination Committee of Special Procedures. And I would like to remind the Special Procedures that the Council has affected the time-saving measures on 9 February 2026 to remind them of time limits when speaking before the Council, as everybody else. I now give the floor to Ms. Mohadese Falahet, mother of 2 children killed in the strike on the school in Minap.
بسم رب شهداء و صدیقین. آقای رئیس، خانم ها و آقایان، من یک مادرم. مادری که هنوز هم وقتی از کنار اتاق امین و مهدی رد می شود، دلش می خواهد در را باز کند و ببیند که مثل همیشه روی تختشان دراز کشیدند یا نقاشی می کشند. اما اتاق ساکت است. خیلی ساکت تر از چیزی که یک خانه باید باشد. صبح آن روز مثل هر روز دیگر بود. برایم عادی بود که کفش‌هایشان را جلوی در مرتب کنم، موهایشان را شانه بزنم و کیفشان را روی دوششان بگذارم. هیچ نشانه‌ای نبود که این آخرین بار باشد. وقتی از در رفتن بیرون فقط گفتن مامان بعد از مدرسه بیا دنبالمون. همین جمله ساده حالا 1000 بار در ذهنم تکرار می شود و هر بار قلبم را می سوزاند. هیچ مادری فکر نمی کند که بچه‌اش را با لبخند راهی مدرسه کند و بعد فقط سکوت بماند. هیچ مادری آمادگی شنیدن این جمله را ندارد که فرزندت دیگر بر نمی گردد. این روزها هر بچه‌ای را می بینم، یک لحظه فکر می کنم شاید اگر امین و مهدی هم بودند همینطور می دویدند و بازی می کردند. همینطور می خندیدند، همینطور زندگی می کردند. لباسهایی که برای سال نو با ذوق خریده بودند هنوز همانجاست. دفترهایشان نیمه تمام و رویاهایی که هیچ وقت فرصت نکرد ادامهشان را بنویسند. من فقط یک مادر داغدار نیستم. من صدای تمام مادرانی هستم که بچه‌هایشان را با خیال امنیت به مدرسه فرستادند. مدرسه‌ای که جایی برای یاد گرفتن، خندیدن و ساختن آینده بود. جایی امن برای کودکانی که قرار بود فردای این جهان را بسازند. نه جایی که آیندهشان در یک لحظه خاموش شد. از شورای حقوق بشر و اعضای آن، از نهادهای مسئول و از همه کسانی که وظیفه و توان دفاع از جان کودکان را دارند می‌خواهم که این فاجعه فراموش نشود. حقیقت باید روشن شود و اسرائیل و آمریکا که باعث این درد شدید شدند باید پاسخگو باشند. نه برای انتقام بلکه برای عدالت، برای اینکه دنیا بداند جان کودکان بی ارزش نیست و هیچ پدر و مادری نباید دوباره چنین انتظاری را تجربه کند.
Thank you. I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Syed Abbas Arakchi, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Distinguished delegates, dear colleagues. Iran stands today amid the throes of an illegal war imposed by two bullying nuclear-armed regimes, the United States and Israel. This war of aggression is blatantly unjustified and brutal. They initiated this aggression on 28 February, while Iran and the United States were engaged in a diplomatic process to resolve Americans' alleged concerns over Iran's nuclear program. They betrayed diplomacy for a second time in the course of 9 months by torpedoing the negotiating table. Among the most harrowing manifestations of this aggression was the calculated, phased assault on Shajara Tayyebe Elementary School in the city of Minab, south of Iran, where more than 175 students and teachers were slaughtered in cold blood. This barbaric attack is but the visible tip of a far bigger iceberg, one that conceals beneath its surface far graver catastrophes, namely the normalization of the most abhorrent violations of human rights and humanitarian law, and the audacity to commit atrocity crimes with impunity. Mr. President, at a time when the American-Israeli aggressors, in their own assertions, possess the most advanced technologies and the highest precision military and data systems, no one can believe that the attack on the school was anything other than deliberate and intentional. Targeting Shajara Tayyebe School was a war crime and a crime against humanity, one that demands unequivocal condemnation by all and unambiguous accountability for the culprits. This atrocity cannot be justified, cannot be concealed, and must not be met with silence and indifference. The attack on Shajara Tayyebe School in Minab was not a mere incident nor a miscalculation. The United States' contradictory remarks aimed at justifying their crime could not, in any manner, elude their responsibility. To denounce such a merciless assault on a place inherently civilian, a place where the most innocents reside and pursue knowledge, is not merely a legal obligation under human rights frameworks. It is a moral and human imperative. Our conscience will judge us more profoundly than any tribunal ever could. Distinguished delegates, Shajara Tayyebe Elementary School has not been the only casualty of American-Israeli atrocity crimes during the past 27 days of their illegal war. Human rights and international humanitarian law have been massively and systematically violated by the invaders in an unprecedentedly brutal manner. They are targeting civilians and civilian infrastructures with no regard for laws of war and basic principles of humanity and civility. More than 600 schools have been demolished or damaged across Iran, and more than 1,000 students and teachers martyred or wounded as the result. The aggressors, who are arrogantly shouting "No mercy, no quarters," and threatening to strike Iran's vital infrastructure, have been attacking hospitals, ambulances, health workers, Red Crescent rescuers, refineries, water sources, and residential areas. War crime and crime against humanity are not sufficiently describing the gravity of the atrocities they are committing. The aggressors' targeting pattern, accompanied by their rhetoric, leave little doubt as to their clear intent to commit genocide. Distinguished colleagues, this unjust war of whims by the United States and Israel against the noble nation of Iran is the direct result of silence in the face of earlier manifestations of lawlessness and atrocity in occupied Palestine, Lebanon, and elsewhere. Indifference and silence in the face of injustices would bring no security and peace. It would invite more insecurity and right violations. The United Nations and the core values it embodies, as well as the overall human rights framework, are at serious stake. You all need to call out the aggressors and let them know that the community of states, the human collective conscience, hold them accountable for the abhorrent crimes they are committing against Iranians. Iran has never sought war. Iranians are a peaceful, noble nation inheriting one of the richest civilizations on earth. Yet, they have demonstrated absolute resolve and determination to defend themselves against the brutal aggressors who know no boundary in perpetrating all sorts of crimes, a defense that shall persist as long as needed. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Before we proceed with the list of speakers, allow me to request to all delegations to deal with human rights issues with dignity, and also remind all of you to adhere to the well-established principles of the United Nations, and this includes to uphold UN standards when referring to countries. The list of speakers is now closed, and we shall now begin with the list of members of the Council, and I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Norway on behalf of a group of countries.
Thank you, Mr. President. On behalf of Iceland and Norway, we welcome this urgent debate. The Middle East is on fire. Human suffering is severe and immediate. Beyond the region, it has growing and profound consequences on global stability, on energy and food security. We are deeply alarmed by the human rights and humanitarian crisis caused by the warfare, with civilians displaced, injured and killed across the region. On the first day of the war, more than 170 children were deplorably killed when the girls' school in Minab was hit. And since then, several schools, hospitals, energy infrastructure and other civilian objects have also been hit, increasing risk to all civilians. This is unacceptable. We call on all parties to respect IHL and to use the tools of the Safe Schools Declaration to protect children and education. Neither the US and Israeli strikes against Iran, nor the Iranian attacks on countries in the region are in accordance with international law. The human rights situation in Iran, especially with regards to women and girls, is intolerable. Once again, we call on the Islamic Republic of Iran to respect all human rights for all. President, we call on the parties to end the war and to find diplomatic solutions to unlock the current stalemate in the region. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the European Union.
Mr. President, I speak on behalf of the EU. Albania, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Liechtenstein, North Macedonia, Moldova, Montenegro and Ukraine align themselves with this statement. The EU deplores the loss of all civilian life and calls for an immediate end to strikes against civilian infrastructure. We call for de-escalation and restraint, protection of civilians and respect of international law, including the UN Charter, by all parties. We are deeply saddened by the loss of children's lives in Iran, including those killed in the strike against the school in Minab. The EU calls on all parties to take all measures to ensure children's rights are fully respected. Attacks against civilian objects constitute a violation of IHL. We call on all parties to take necessary measures to protect children, including ensuring that civilian facilities are not attacked. The EU calls on Iran to cease violence and repression against its own people. The EU calls for the respect of the rights and freedoms of the Iranian people. The EU has taken targeted restrictive measures against those responsible for serious human rights violations in Iran and will continue to do so as long as necessary. The EU fully supports the work of the FFM and of the SR. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Venezuela on behalf of a group of countries.
Gracias, presidente. El Grupo de Amigos en Defensa de la Carta de las Naciones Unidas acoge con beneplácito la iniciativa de Irán, China y Cuba de solicitar este debate urgente. Condenamos en los términos más enérgicos los ataques coordinados e ilícitos contra Irán el 28 de febrero de 2026, incluidos los ataques contra infraestructura civil. Israel y Estados Unidos deben respetar el derecho internacional y el derecho internacional humanitario. Estamos profundamente preocupados por el ataque contra la escuela primaria en Minab, que causó la trágica pérdida de casi 170 vidas, principalmente de niños y niñas entre 7 y 12 años, y dejó muchos heridos. Recordamos que los ataques deliberados contra escuelas constituyen crímenes de guerra. Todos los Estados tienen la responsabilidad primordial de respetar y garantizar el pleno disfrute de los derechos humanos y de cumplir estrictamente sus obligaciones en virtud del derecho internacional humanitario en situaciones de conflicto armado. Expresamos nuestra profunda preocupación por las crecientes amenazas a la infraestructura civil. También nos preocupan los impactos ambientales y humanitarios de la lluvia ácida y la contaminación tóxica resultantes de los ataques contra la infraestructura petrolera y las explosiones subsiguientes. Las consecuencias a largo plazo de tales incidentes se extienden más allá de una sola generación. El derecho internacional humanitario y sus principios de distinción, proporcionalidad y precaución deben respetarse plenamente en todo momento durante el desarrollo de hostilidades. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. And I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Indonesia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Indonesia strongly condemns the deliberate attack against Sajareh Tayyab's girls' school in Minab, carried out in the context of the unprovoked military campaign by the US and Israel across Iran. We extend our deepest condolences to the people of Iran, particularly the families of the victims. Across the Middle East, we have seen thousands of schools in Gaza, Iran, and Lebanon, along with hospitals and homes have been destroyed in patterns of this attack. No military or political justification can excuse the killing of children. This attack reflects a method of warfare we have seen in Gaza. Repeated strikes on civilian infrastructure where harm to civilians is part of a broader pattern resulting in widespread destruction. This Council has to recognize the growing application of Israel-Gaza method, where children and families are assassinated for political and military purposes. Francesca Albanese clearly warned us about this. I call on this Council to recognize this danger. The growing grave violation of international humanitarian and human rights law may amount to war crimes in Iran and across the region. Accountability is essential, and this Council must not allow silence or selectivity to embolden impunity. Indonesia therefore calls for an independent and impartial investigation, full accountability for those responsible, and comprehensive redress for victims. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ethiopia.
Mr. President, Ethiopia reaffirms its unwavering commitment to the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter, including the prohibition of the use of force and the peaceful resolution of disputes. We express our grave concern over the deteriorating situation in the Middle East and urgently call for an immediate cessation of hostilities. We extend our condolences to the families of the victims and to all those affected by the ongoing violence in the region. We urge all parties to exercise maximum restraint, take all feasible measures to protect civilians and civilian infrastructure, and fully comply with international humanitarian and human rights law. Ethiopia calls upon the international community to redouble its efforts towards de-escalation and to place renewed emphasis on dialogue and diplomacy as the only viable path to sustainable peace and lasting stability. In closing, Ethiopia remains ready to constructively engage with and support all credible initiatives aimed at advancing peace, strengthening security, and fostering stability. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Colombia.
Gracias, señor presidente. Las niñas y los niños son las víctimas más vulnerables y a quienes más deberíamos proteger en los conflictos armados. La humanidad no debería ahorrar esfuerzos para garantizar el futuro de nuestro planeta. Todas las partes en los conflictos armados tienen que entender que no hacerlo es cruzar líneas rojas imperdonables. Colombia rechaza categóricamente el ataque a la escuela primaria en Minat, que acabó con la vida de casi 200 niñas. Se solidariza con todas las víctimas de las hostilidades armadas en el Medio Oriente y lamenta profundamente que la población civil sufra las consecuencias de la espiral de violencia derivado de la agresión militar de Estados Unidos e Israel contra Irán. Tal como lo han mencionado el Alto Comisionado, la Relatora Especial para Irán y la Misión Internacional Independiente de Investigación, todas las partes en el conflicto deben respetar los principios de distinción, proporcionalidad y precaución, ceñirse a la protección que les otorga el DIH a las escuelas y a la educación y de aplicar las directrices para prevenir el uso militar de escuelas y universidades durante conflictos armados. Hacemos un llamado al cese al fuego inmediato e incondicional, al respeto al derecho internacional humanitario, a proteger a la población civil y a que los trágicos hechos de la escuela en Minab no queden en la impunidad y a que los responsables rindan cuentas ante la justicia. Gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Mexico.
Gracias, señor presidente. Agradecemos a los países promoventes por convocar este debate. México comparte la profunda preocupación por las implicaciones generalizadas en los derechos humanos que han resultado de la agravación del conflicto en el Medio Oriente, iniciado el 28 de febrero. México se solidariza con todos los gobiernos y pueblos de los países afectados y lamenta profundamente el impacto humanitario del conflicto que afecta a las poblaciones más vulnerables y en particular a las niñas, quienes enfrentan impactos diferenciados por factores como el género y la edad. Deploramos en particular los ataques contra escuelas, como fue el caso de la escuela en Minab, así como contra hospitales e infraestructuras civiles esenciales que constituyen violaciones flagrantes al derecho internacional humanitario. La pérdida de niños, niñas y adolescentes en conflictos armados es una tragedia inadmisible y una violación a sus derechos fundamentales, incluido su derecho a la vida. Las convenciones de Ginebra exigen proteger a la población civil y distinguir entre objetivos militares y civiles, incluyendo las escuelas. Por último, hacemos un llamado a todas las partes al diálogo, la solución pacífica de las controversias y a respetar el derecho internacional humanitario y los derechos humanos, única forma para poner fin a este conflicto. Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of China.
主席先生，伊朗米纳普小学遭袭，168名花季女童鲜活的生命被剥夺，这一暴行突破了人类道德良知的底线，是对人权的最大侵犯，是对国际人道法的公然蔑视。中方对此深感震惊，严厉谴责，对遇难者家属的悲痛感同身受。美国和以色列未经安理会的授权，悍然对伊朗发动袭击，是造成这一悲剧的根源。美以不仅杀害伊朗领导人，严重侵犯伊朗人民人权，还引发中东地区冲突升级，地区国家被迫卷入其中。所有国家的主权、安全和领土完整应当得到充分的尊重。中方强烈谴责一切违反国际法、无差别攻击平民和非军事目标的行为。所有的热点问题都应通过对话谈判解决，而不应使用武力。各方应抓住一切和平机会和窗口，以真诚的态度启动和平谈判，用实际行动保护地区人民的基本人权，维护中东地区的和平稳定。谢谢主席先生。
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of India.
Thank you, Mr. President. India remains deeply concerned at the evolving situation in West Asia. As a proximate neighbor with critical stakes in the security and stability of the region, these developments evoke great anxiety. India expresses profound grief over the loss of precious lives due to the attack on the Sharjah Tayyib girls' school in Minab. This tragedy underlines once again the urgent need to ensure that schools, hospitals, energy and other civilian infrastructure are never targets in situations of armed conflict. India reiterates that there is no alternative to dialogue and diplomacy. India has consistently urged all sides to exercise restraint, avoid escalation and prioritize the safety of civilians. All outstanding issues must be addressed through peaceful means with full respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all states. Mr. President, India stands ready to support all constructive efforts aimed at de-escalation, fostering dialogue and promoting lasting peace, stability and security in West Asia. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Iraq.
شكرا السيد الرئيس. يعقد هذا النقاش الطارئ في سياق بالغ الخطورة بسبب تفاقم العمليات العسكرية التي أثرت على العراق والمنطقة والعالم في تهديد مباشر للأمن والاستقرار وانتهاكا واضحا للمبادئ والقواعد الأساسية للقانون الدولي، ما يعرض المصالح الاقتصادية وسلامة المدنيين لمخاطر جسيمة وينعكس سلبا على استقرار أسواق الطاقة العالمية. السيد الرئيس يدين العراق بأشد العبارات أي اعتداء يستهدف الأطفال والمؤسسات التعليمية خلال النزاعات المسلحة، لما يشكله ذلك من انتهاك صارخ لمبادئ القانون الإنساني الدولي والقانون الدولي لحقوق الإنسان، إذ إن استهداف المدارس يعد انتهاكا جسيما لحقوق الإنسان وتهديدا مباشرا لمستقبل المجتمعات واستقرارها. ويؤكد العراق أن حماية الأطفال أثناء النزاعات المسلحة تمثل مسؤولية جماعية تقع على عاتق المجتمع الدولي بأسره. وفي الختام يجدد العراق دعوته لاحترام حقوق الأطفال في جميع الأوقات وصون كرامتهم وحقوقهم الأساسية، ويؤكد العراق على أن توسيع رقعة الحرب ستؤدي إلى تعميق الأزمات وتقويض الاستقرار، ويدعو إلى اعتماد الحوار سبيلا لتسوية الخلافات بالطرق السلمية وتحقيق الأمن والاستقرار. شكرا السيد الرئيس.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Slovenia.
Thank you, Mr. President. As consistently underlined throughout this Human Rights Council session, Slovenia condemns the military escalation by all parties in the Middle East. This war is fueling dangerous regional instability, profound human suffering and destruction. Numerous young lives have deplorably been lost, the girls' lives at the school in Minab, as well as in other parts of the region. International humanitarian law is clear. Attacks on schools are prohibited. The Geneva Conventions and their additional protocols impose obligations to afford special protection to children. The Convention on the Rights of the Child reinforces the right to education, even during conflict. Within the Children and Armed Conflict framework, attacks against schools and hospitals are recognized as one of the 6 grave violations against children. Despite these clear norms, deliberate or indiscriminate targeting of schools, educational facilities, teachers and students are increasing in both frequency and scale. Perpetrators of grave violations against children and against civilians in general must be brought to justice in line with international law and standards. To conclude, Mr. President, Slovenia reiterates its call on all parties in this conflict for de-escalation, maximum restraint and full respect of international law. Only diplomacy and negotiations in good faith are a viable path towards peace and security for children and civilians in the region. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Spain.
Gracias, señor presidente. España se suma a la declaración de la Unión Europea. El pasado 28 de febrero, los bombardeos ilegales de Israel y Estados Unidos desencadenaron otra peligrosa espiral de violencia en Oriente Medio, tras las posteriores oleadas de ataques indiscriminados e injustificados de Irán. La escalada regional tiene ya consecuencias globales. Reiteramos nuestra condena a toda acción contraria al derecho internacional y la Carta de Naciones Unidas. Las niñas de Minab y sus profesores han sido víctimas de un ataque también contrario al derecho internacional. Esperamos que la misión de verificación de los hechos y la relatora especial para los derechos humanos en Irán puedan documentar lo sucedido para la debida rendición de cuentas. España reitera su compromiso con la justicia y la transparencia. No debemos normalizar que matar niños en bombardeos sea algo inevitable, que sean meros daños colaterales de las operaciones militares. Cada vez que se destruye una escuela, se destruye el futuro de una generación. Por eso España es una convencida signataria de la Declaración de Escuelas Seguras. Nuestra mirada tiene que ser amplia y coherente. Mientras Irán nos convoca a este debate urgente, las autoridades del país perpetran ahora mismo ejecuciones sumarias y una represión sistemática contra su población por ejercer su libertad de expresión y de manifestación. Una represión que se ceba en mujeres y niñas, cuyos derechos son sistemáticamente vulnerados. Y recordamos aquí hace unos días el caso de Masha Amini, asesinada en el 22, solo por vestir como quería. España urge a todas las partes a la desescalada, el respeto del derecho internacional, el retorno a la vía diplomática y, sobre todo, a evitar nuevas atrocidades. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Brazil.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Brazil strongly condemns the bombing of the educational facility in Minab that resulted in the deaths of 168 schoolgirls aged between 7 and 12, along with their educators. This act constitutes a grave violation of human rights and humanitarian law. We are currently witnessing an erosion of multilateralism, alongside systematic disregard for international law, including international human rights law and international humanitarian law. This appears to have become a constant across various global conflicts. The current situation in the Middle East would justify a comprehensive and non-selective debate in this Council, Mr. President, one that addresses human rights violations in the entire region and the responsibilities of all parties involved in the hostilities. It would also demand the fulfillment of international obligations to protect civilians, and we regret that the path of fragmentation has prevailed over a holistic approach to the crisis. We recall that the protection of children in armed conflict will be the subject of a specific resolution during this 61st session presented by GRULEC and the European Union. To conclude, let me be clear. Children must be protected at all times and without exception. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of France.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Monsieur le Président, la guerre au Moyen-Orient menace gravement la sécurité régionale et doit cesser au plus vite. Seul le respect du droit international et le retour à la diplomatie peuvent permettre d'assurer de façon durable la sécurité et la stabilité de la région. La frappe qui a touché l'école de Minab a suscité une vive émotion. La France adresse ses condoléances aux familles de victimes. Elle souhaite que toute la lumière soit faite sur cette tragédie. Nous appelons au respect par toutes les parties du droit international humanitaire. Il est impératif de mettre en œuvre sans délai un moratoire sur les frappes ciblant les infrastructures civiles afin de protéger les populations civiles et de préserver l'accès aux services de base ainsi que la production énergétique. Monsieur le Président, la France n'oublie pas que l'Iran vise délibérément et systématiquement les populations civiles et les infrastructures civiles, ce qu'elle condamne avec la plus grande fermeté. Elle n'oublie pas non plus les multiples violations des droits de l'homme commises par le régime et continue de se tenir aux côtés du peuple iranien. La France a soutenu le renouvellement des mandats de la mission d'établissement des faits et du rapporteur spécial, indispensable pour continuer de documenter ces violations des droits de l'homme, en particulier lors de la répression brutale des manifestations de janvier, où les Iraniennes et Iraniens n'ont fait qu'exercer leurs droits. Je vous remercie.
Thank you. Before I give the floor to the next delegation, let me remind all of you to adhere to the well-established principle of the United Nations to uphold UN standards when referring to countries. And I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Cuba.
Señor Presidente, el pasado 28 de febrero, Estados Unidos e Israel iniciaron un ataque militar contra Irán en flagrante violación de la Carta de la ONU y el derecho internacional. Cuba condena en los términos más enérgicos esa agresión y exigimos su cese inmediato. Como resultado del ataque contra una escuela primaria en Minab, 168 niñas iraníes fueron asesinadas y muchas otras heridas. Conmueven las horrendas imágenes de las aulas convertidas en ruinas por la explosión. Los responsables ni siquiera se han disculpado. Este no es un hecho aislado. Muchos otros objetivos civiles en Irán han sido atacados. Las escuelas son espacios protegidos. No hay ninguna justificación para bombardear un colegio lleno de niñas. Esto no es un daño colateral, es un crimen de guerra. Este Consejo debería condenar la tragedia en Minab más allá de las diferencias políticas e ideológicas. Es por ello que Cuba copatrocina este debate urgente. La defensa del derecho humano a la vida y la inviolabilidad de las escuelas no puede ser selectiva. Urge establecer un mecanismo de investigación independiente e imparcial para que los responsables rindan cuenta. Se cometería una gran injusticia con las víctimas si ello no sucede. Las víctimas tienen derecho a la verdad y a la reparación. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom.
Mr. President, we are appalled by all reports of civilian deaths in Minab, in Iran, and across the region. Innocent civilians should never be caught in the crossfire. Our thoughts are with the victims and their families. We support all action that will help bring a swift end to this conflict. Mr. President, even in times of conflict, we cannot ignore Iran's own human rights record, which remains dire. Just 2 months ago, this Council met to condemn the brutal killing of thousands of Iranian protesters exercising their right to peaceful protest. Iran's abhorrent use of the death penalty and continued internet restrictions fuel cycles of repression for the people of Iran. The UK will continue to work with international partners, including the UN fact-finding mission and the Special Rapporteur, to hold Iran to account for its repression of women and girls, religious and ethnic minorities, and human rights defenders. We know it takes huge bravery to protest and to speak out in the face of this oppression, especially for women and girls who continue to endure severe repression in their daily lives. Mr. President, the UK demands that the Iranian authorities fully respect human rights and fundamental freedoms of all people in Iran. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Angola.
Mr. President, a strike against a school constitutes a grave violation of the rights of children and on education itself, undermining the very foundation of the future of any society. Such acts are particularly alarming as they target those who are most vulnerable and jeopardize the prospects of entire communities. Schools, civilian objects, and children benefit from explicit protection under the international humanitarian law. Accordingly, any attack against them is strictly prohibited. Angola expresses its deep concern over the escalation and tensions in the region, which continue to exacerbate this instability and contribute to the deterioration of the human rights and humanitarian situation. In this regard, Angola calls for maximum restraint by all parties, emphasizing that further intensification of hostilities will only deepen human suffering and hinder prospects for peace. Angola's position remains firmly grounded in its unwavering respect for the principles enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations, namely the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states, the peaceful settlement of disputes, and the prohibition of the use of the force outside the framework of international law. The Middle East deserves to live in peace, stability, and sustainable development. In this regard, it is the collective responsibility of the international community, including this Council, to act with urgency and determination to prevent further escalation and to promote meaningful pathways for dialogue, de-escalation and reconciliation. I thank you, Mr. President.
I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Mauritius.
Mauritius notes with concern the escalation of hostilities in the Middle East that has caused civilian casualties and destruction of civilian infrastructure and property. We condemn the reckless and indiscriminate attack on the girls' school in Minab, which resulted in loss of lives of civilians, in particular girls aged between 7 and 12. This is a serious breach of international humanitarian law. Such attacks are a violation of the CRC, its optional protocol on the involvement of children in armed conflict, the 4th Geneva Convention, and the Safe Schools Declaration, which call for the protection of children and education in conflict. Children and educational institutions should never be a target. Yet, unfortunately, we see this happening again and again. We call on all parties to the conflict to exercise restraint and to respect and uphold international humanitarian law and human rights law. We further call, once again, for a cessation of hostilities. Civilians should not and never pay the price of an armed conflict. Any resolution of the situation must be pursued in accordance with the principles and purposes of the UN Charter and the fundamental principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity of states. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Netherlands.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Kingdom of the Netherlands aligns itself with the statement of the European Union. We are deeply concerned about the ongoing escalation in the Middle East and recall our statement made during Wednesday's urgent debate on Iran's attacks against the GCC and Jordan. Our thoughts are with the families of the children that tragically lost their lives in the strike of a school in Minab on the 28th of February. We call for an immediate end of all attacks targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure, including schools, which must remain safe spaces for learning and are protected under international humanitarian law. Children must be protected at all times from direct and indirect effects of hostilities. We support the ongoing monitoring and investigation of the International Independent Fact-Finding Mission and the Special Rapporteur, and ask for adequate resources and institutional support so that they can carry out their independent monitoring and investigative work. Widespread human rights violations persist unabated in Iran, which we condemn. We call upon Iran to provide full access to the country. Mr. President, we call for de-escalation and maximum restraint and call on all parties to comply with obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Italy.
Thank you, Mr. President. Italy aligns itself with the statement of the European Union. We express our condolences and deep sorrow for the loss of 165 school children following the attack on a school in Minab. Italy is particularly concerned about the severe impact of the ongoing military escalation in the region on civilians and their human rights. Children are among the most vulnerable victims of conflicts and continue to suffer unacceptable violence. In this regard, international humanitarian law serves both as a legal obligation and as a warning. It recognizes general protection against attacks on military use of schools as civilian objects. Even when they do not cause casualties, attacks on schools immediately affect children's right to education and the reconstruction of post-conflict societies. As a supporter of the Safe Schools Declaration, Italy will continue to encourage other countries to endorse and implement the declaration. Mr. President, children must be always protected, both in war and in peace. We urge the Iranian authorities to uphold their international obligations, including by stopping all executions, especially of minors convicted of crimes committed before they were 18 years old. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of South Africa.
Thank you, Mr. President. Earlier this month, the Deputy High Commissioner reminded us that war is the ultimate violation of a child's right. Yet, as reflected by the topic of this urgent debate, it is children who are bearing the brunt of the military escalation in the Middle East. South Africa condemns the aerial attack on Sharaje Tayeb Girls' School, resulting in the death of 168 children. This horrific act not only shattered the lives of innocent children and teachers, but also struck at the very core of what schools represent, the promise of a brighter future. We therefore express our most profound condolences with the families of all victims and solidarity with survivors. In so doing, we wish to remind all parties of their obligations to uphold international law, including international human rights law, international humanitarian law, and the UN Charter. The children of the region deserve better. Schools must remain safe havens where young minds can thrive from fear. We thus urge the parties to de-escalate and use dialogue as a means of resolving the conflict instead of beating the drums of war. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Thailand.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thailand is profoundly saddened by the attack on girls' schools in Minab and the tragic loss of civilian lives, most of them innocent children. We extend our sincere condolences to all victims and their families. Thailand reaffirms the principles enshrined in the UN Charter, including non-use of force and peaceful resolution of dispute. This war should never have happened. We regret that diplomacy was not given a chance. We are gravely concerned by the escalating situation and its widening humanitarian impact, both within Iran and across the region. Attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructures are unacceptable. Medical facilities, schools, residential areas, and essential energy infrastructures must be protected, as they sustain civilian lives and livelihoods. Thailand calls for strict compliance with international human rights and humanitarian law. We are also concerned by the growing global consequences of this conflict, with significant economic and social repercussions and implications for international peace and security. Thailand calls on all parties to exercise maximum restraint, cease hostilities, de-escalate tensions, and urgently return to dialogue and diplomacy towards peaceful resolution grounded in international law and the UN Charter. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Vietnam.
Mr. President, Vietnam unequivocally opposes the use of force against targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure. We express deep concern over civilian casualties resulting from the ongoing conflicts in the region, particularly among girls and other vulnerable groups. The targeting of schools and educational facilities is especially concerning as it deprives children of safety, dignity, and their fundamental right to education. Civilians, schools, and essential civilian infrastructure must be protected under all circumstances. Vietnam calls on all parties to exercise maximum restraint and to fully comply with international law, in particular international humanitarian law, the UN Charter, and the independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of states in the region. We call for an immediate end to all escalatory actions and urge the resumption of negotiations. Vietnam expresses its support for the efforts of all relevant countries and international organizations to de-escalate tensions, promote dialogue, and seek peaceful solutions to the conflict. We wish to recall that Vietnam, together with ASEAN member states, issued an ASEAN Foreign Ministers statement on the situation in the Middle East on the 4th of March. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Pakistan.
Thank you, Mr. President. Across conflict zones and situations of foreign occupation around the world, millions of children are growing up amid rubble and trauma rather than in classrooms or playgrounds. Pakistan offers its sincere condolences to civilian victims, their families, and communities. The unconscionable deaths of schoolgirls in Iran weigh heavily on our minds, as do those of civilian victims in Gulf countries, including Pakistani expatriates. Across the Middle East, tens of thousands of innocent victims have seen their lives cut short. Others bear lifelong injury or psychological scars that may never heal. The haunting voice of Hind Rajab will always echo for the children of Gaza. Countless child victims and war orphans remind us of how far we are from an environment which fosters the health, self-respect, and dignity of the child promised by the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. We reiterate our condemnation of the unwarranted attacks against the Islamic Republic of Iran in violation of international law. We condemn also the unjustifiable attacks against our brotherly countries from the GCC and Jordan. Their continued restraint is commendable. This war must end. A comprehensive and lasting peace must be our goal. All actions that prolong the conflict and increase its immense human cost must be avoided. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Chile.
Gracias, señor presidente. Consideramos fundamental que este Consejo aborde esta situación desde su mandato específico, centrado en la dignidad humana y la protección de los derechos humanos de las personas afectadas. La protección de la población civil, especialmente de los niños y niñas en contextos de conflicto, debe ser una prioridad para este Consejo. Es imprescindible recordar que ellos están entre quienes más sufren las consecuencias de los conflictos armados. Las tendencias actuales, recogidas en el más reciente informe de la representante especial del Secretario General para los Niños y los Conflictos Armados, evidencian un panorama alarmante, con un deterioro significativo en su protección. Entre los derechos gravemente vulnerados se encuentra el derecho a la educación, pilar fundamental para garantizar una paz sostenible y resiliencia de las futuras generaciones. Garantizar el acceso a la educación constituye una herramienta clave para la reintegración de los niños afectados por conflictos y contribuye directamente a los objetivos de desarrollo sostenible. Hacemos un llamado a todas las partes para que cumplan con sus obligaciones en virtud del derecho internacional de los derechos humanos y el derecho internacional humanitario y a un cese definitivo de las hostilidades. La única manera de que tanto niñas como niños como sus familias dejen de perder sus vidas y puedan disfrutar plenamente de sus derechos es a través del diálogo y la resolución pacífica de controversias. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, Japan thanks the High Commissioner and other speakers for their inputs. The peace and stability of the Middle East, including the safety of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz, is of utmost importance to Japan. We are deeply concerned about the ongoing deterioration of the regional situation surrounding Iran, which has serious implications for the protection and promotion of human rights. The protection of human rights is a basic responsibility of all nations. It is essential that the international community continue dialogue and cooperation with a view to fulfilling this responsibility. As a country that respects fundamental values and principles such as freedom, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law, Japan will continue to make all necessary diplomatic efforts in coordination with the international community to bring about an early de-escalation of the situation, thereby also improving secure access to safe and quality education in the region, which is fundamental to the future. In this regard, Japan remains open to dialogue with all stakeholders, including Iran, to further exchange views on efforts to promote and protect the human rights of all individuals. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Gambia.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Gambia expresses deep concern and strongly condemns the missile struck on Sajere Taibe Girls Elementary School in Minab, which resulted in the loss of civilian lives, including more than 100 innocent children. We extend our sincere condolences to the government and people of the Islamic Republic of Iran on this tragic loss. We recall the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which affirms the right of every child to life and protection from violence. We also recall the Safe Schools Declaration of 2015, which emphasizes the imperative of ensuring that schools remain safe spaces for learning, even in the midst of armed conflict. The protection of children, educational and health institutions must remain a priority at all times. We further emphasize the obligation of all states under international humanitarian law, including the Geneva Conventions, to ensure full respect for the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution in the conduct of hostilities. We call on all parties to the current conflict to recommit to the fundamental principles of the United Nations Charter, including respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity of states, as well as the obligation to resolve disputes through peaceful means. In line with its mandate, the Council must live up to its obligation of addressing human rights violations whenever they occur. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Dominican Republic.
Gracias, señor presidente. República Dominicana expresa su profunda preocupación por los ataques contra niños e instituciones educativas en contextos de conflictos armados. La protección de la niñez constituye una obligación central del derecho internacional. En particular, las escuelas, como bienes de carácter civil, deben ser respetadas y protegidas en todo momento. Conforme a los convenios de Ginebra de 1949 y sus normas consuetudinarias, las partes en conflicto están obligadas a distinguir entre población civil y combatientes, así como entre bienes civiles y objetivos militares. Reafirmamos nuestro compromiso con los principios fundamentales del derecho internacional, en particular con el derecho internacional humanitario y el derecho internacional de los derechos humanos. De igual forma, resaltamos la importancia de la resolución sobre la realización del derecho de los niños en los conflictos armados, la cual está siendo apoyada por el Estado dominicano. Señor presidente, este debate urgente debe servir para reforzar el compromiso de la comunidad internacional con la protección efectiva de los niños en conflictos armados y con la rendición de cuenta frente a las violaciones graves del derecho internacional humanitario. República Dominicana reitera que el respeto del derecho internacional y el fortalecimiento del multilateralismo constituyen la única vía legítima para la prevención de conflictos y la construcción de una paz duradera. Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Switzerland.
La Suisse est profondément préoccupée par l'escalade en cours. La protection des populations civiles et des infrastructures civiles est une obligation pour toutes les parties en vertu du droit international humanitaire et des droits de l'homme. Ce doit être une priorité absolue. Nous sommes consternés par les attaques visant des infrastructures éducatives, en particulier une école de jeunes filles en Iran. En tant que biens de caractère civil, elles doivent être protégées en toutes circonstances. Il s'agit de graves violations du droit international que la Suisse condamne. Face à ces développements, la Suisse exprime sa solidarité avec les victimes et toutes les populations affectées par ce conflit. En même temps, la Suisse condamne fermement la répression violente en Iran et les exécutions en lien avec les manifestations récentes et appelle les autorités iraniennes à ce que ne soit procédé à aucune exécution supplémentaire. La Suisse rappelle toutes les parties à respecter le droit international, en particulier la Charte des Nations Unies, le droit international humanitaire et les droits de l'homme. Le respect de l'interdiction du recours à la force est essentiel. Les actions des États-Unis et d'Israël contre l'Iran, tout comme les actes de l'Iran dépassant le cadre du droit de légitime défense, soulèvent de vives inquiétudes. La Suisse appelle à une retenue maximale et à la cessation immédiate des hostilités. Elle demeure engagée en tant qu'acteur neutre à promouvoir la désescalade, le respect du droit international et ses bons offices. Je vous remercie.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Kenya.
Mr. President, the tragic attack on Shajareh Tayyebe Girls' School in Minab, Iran on 28 February and the reported loss of over 160 young lives represents the devastating human cost when civilian sites, particularly schools, are impacted in conflict. My delegation expresses our deep condolences to the families of the victims. Mr. President, Kenya underscores our long-standing commitments to civilian protection. As a champion of these principles, we hosted the 5th International Conference on the Safe Schools Declaration in Nairobi in November 2025, during which 121 endorsing states advanced concrete measures to strengthen safeguards against attacks on schools, prohibit their military use, promote safe access to education, and enhance support for affected students and teachers. We call on all parties to armed conflict to comply fully with their IHL obligations, including the special protections afforded to children and civilian objects. We further call on all parties to exercise maximum restraint, prioritize dialogue, and address security concerns through diplomatic mechanisms. Urgent de-escalation remains paramount to safeguard civilians and restore sustainable peace across the region. We further urge all states to prioritize practical steps that shield the most vulnerable and preserve education as a foundation for peace. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Albania.
Monsieur le Président, l'Albanie exprime sa profonde inquiétude face à l'escalade rapide et dangereuse de la situation au Moyen-Orient. Comme toujours dans tout le conflit armé, ce sont les civils qui en payent le prix fort. C'est malheureusement le cas des élèves de Minab et leurs enseignants. L'Albanie espère que la mission internationale indépendante d'établissement de faits sur l'Iran, qui est mandatée par ce Conseil, puisse nous apporter des conclusions et documenter des éléments de preuve en vue du futur procédure de responsabilité. La FFM aura tout notre soutien. L'Albanie appelle à une désescalade immédiate, à la protection des civils et des infrastructures essentielles, ainsi qu'à la relance urgente d'un processus diplomatique crédible. Monsieur le Président, en Iran, des citoyens ordinaires se sont levés pour la dignité et la liberté. Beaucoup ont payé ce choix de leur vie, de leur liberté ou de leur sécurité. Leur courage impose à la communauté internationale de ne pas détourner leur regard. L'Iran doit mettre un terme à la répression et aux violences ignobles exercée à l'encontre de son propre peuple et qui perdure depuis des décennies. L'Albanie se tient aux côtés du peuple iranien et de ses aspirations légitimes à la liberté, à la dignité et à la justice. Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you. Excellencies, distinguished representatives, we shall now proceed with the list of observers of the Council, and I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Australia.
Thank you, President. Australia remains deeply concerned that the conflict in the Middle East continues to endanger civilian lives. Since the outbreak of hostilities, Australia has called on all parties to uphold international humanitarian law and protect civilians and civilian infrastructure. Vulnerable cohorts, especially children, are disproportionately affected by war. Attacks against schools, education infrastructure, and teachers deprives children of the right to learn in safety and shelter from conflict for which they are not responsible. We urge all parties to conflict to prioritise the protection of education, safeguard schools as civilian spaces, and ensure every child has access to safety, learning and hope. On the 9th of March 2026, Australia joined a statement in this forum alongside other nations who have endorsed the Safe Schools Declaration. We reaffirm today that the right to education must be respected during armed conflict. This is grounded in international law and is the cornerstone of the Children and Armed Conflict agenda. Children deserve more than survival. They deserve a future. We have a responsibility to make it possible. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ireland.
President, Ireland aligns with the statement of the European Union. Ireland recalls that international humanitarian law applies to all parties in the conduct of military operations and must be upheld. Current conflicts in the region undermine the human rights of all. We reiterate our call for de-escalation and maximum restraint, the protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure, and full respect for international law by all parties. Ireland is appalled by the bombing of the school in Minab, in which at least 110 children were killed, and offers its condolences to their families. Any killing of children is abhorrent. This must not become normalised as a collateral consequence of war in the Middle East or elsewhere. Thousands of people have been affected by aerial bombardment, drone and missile attacks and displacement across the region. The killing of over 200 children in Iran, over 100 in Lebanon, 4 in Israel and 1 in Kuwait since 28 February is deeply concerning. Protection of civilians and children must be prioritised by parties to conflict. We call on all parties to cease violence and to comply with obligations under international law. Civilian infrastructure, including schools and buildings used for education purposes, must be protected during armed conflict. Those responsible for grave violations against children in armed conflict must be held accountable. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation.
Господин председатель, серьезно обеспокоены продолжением вооруженной конфронтации на Ближнем Востоке и рисками развития ситуации по эскалационному сценарию. Растет масштаб ущерба, причиняемого энергетической и другой жизненно важной инфраструктуре в Иране и соседних арабских государствах. Со своей стороны выступаем за немедленное прекращение всеми сторонами боевых действий и принятие исчерпывающих мер по обеспечению безопасности мирного населения и гражданской инфраструктуры во всех странах региона. Решительно осуждаем удар по школе для девочек в иранском Минабе, в результате которого погибли невинные дети. Любые атаки по гражданским объектам, будь то в Иране или арабских странах, недопустимы и должны быть полностью исключены. Призываем к скорейшему прекращению боевых действий, ставших результатом неспровоцированной агрессии США и Израиля против Ирана. Россия готова содействовать урегулированию разгоревшегося конфликта и поиску решения имеющихся разногласий политико-дипломатическими средствами в целях достижения долгосрочной устойчивой стабилизации в регионе при учете интересов всех его государств. Неизменно выступаем за необходимость создания условий для сосуществования в мире, безопасности и атмосфере добрососедства дружественных нам арабских стран и Ирана. Первым шагом на этом пути должен стать незамедлительный отказ США и Израиля от продолжения своей военной авантюры. Благодарю за внимание.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Libya.
شكرا السيد الرئيس. بداية نتقدم بالتعازي إلى أسر ضحايا مدرسة الشجرة الطيبة للبنات في جمهورية إيران الإسلامية ونؤكد أن استهداف المدارس والمدنيين يشكل انتهاكا صريحا للقانون الدولي الإنساني وهو أمر مرفوض ومدان. إن هذه الواقعة هي شاهد مؤلم آخر على أن الأطفال والمدنيين الأبرياء هم من يدفعون الثمن الأكبر للحروب والنزاعات، وتذكرنا بأهمية احترام القانون الدولي الإنساني. وفي هذا الصدد نذكر بالضرورة الملحة لحماية السكان المدنيين وحماية البنية المدنية التحتية بما في ذلك المدارس والمستشفيات في حالات النزاع بما يتوافق والقانون الدولي الإنساني. كما نشدد على أهمية أن يظل القانون الدولي الإنساني الدليل والمرجعية لكل الأطراف. السيد الرئيس، ندين الاعتداءات الإسرائيلية المستمرة على الشعب الفلسطيني وعلى جمهورية إيران الإسلامية ولبنان الشقيق، والتي تهدد السلم والأمن الإقليميين والدوليين، وندعو المجتمع الدولي لتحمل مسؤولياته ووضع حد لهذه الانتهاكات ومحاسبة المسؤولين عنها. وختاما نشاطر الأمين العام للأمم المتحدة دعوته إلى وقف هذه الحرب، وأن الدبلوماسية واحترام القانون الدولي الإنساني هو الحل. شكرا السيد الرئيس.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Belgium.
Mr. President, Belgium aligns itself with the EU statement. Let me start with a clear message to the initiator of this urgent debate. Iran must stop violently repressing its own population. We condemn this repression in the strongest terms. Iranians deserve to fully enjoy their human rights to strive for a more dignified and democratic future. On the focus of this debate, as we know, IHL is about balancing military necessity with the principle of humanity. Unfortunately, at times, this balance is strained when the conduct of parties to a conflict departs from the humanitarian constraints that the law is designed to uphold. This is particularly evident when schools, hospitals and other civilian objects, each expressly protected under IHL, are targeted. In this regard, and like the High Commissioner, we welcome the ongoing investigations announced by the US authorities and call for these to be completed in a prompt, thorough, independent, impartial and transparent manner. We furthermore urge Iran to instantly cease all of its own indiscriminate attacks. We strongly condemn Iran's attacks against inter alia, residential areas, hotels, diplomatic missions, civilian airports, economic centers, ports and energy infrastructure. To conclude, we repeat our call for immediate de-escalation and maximum restraint, and for the full respect of the core principles of distinction, proportionality and precautions which regulate the conduct of armed conflict. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Maldives.
Mr. President, the Maldives is deeply alarmed by the continued escalation of conflict in the Middle East, following the military attacks initiated by Israel and the United States against Iran. We extend our deepest condolences to the victims and their families and wish speedy recovery to those injured. Schools are not targets. Children are not targets. The Maldives unequivocally condemned the attacks on a girls' school in Minab that resulted in the death of more than 170 children. Such acts constitute a serious violation of international humanitarian law and international human rights law. Israel, already a serial violator of international law and a sponsor of state terrorism, is at the core of fueling this conflict and destruction, reflecting a pattern of continued aggression that has plunged GCC countries and Jordan, as well as Palestine and Lebanon, into crisis. We stress the urgent need to end the long-standing culture of impunity enjoyed by Israel that has enabled such actions to persist. The Maldives reminds all parties of their international obligations and call on the international community to intensify efforts to de-escalate the situation, protect civilians and ensure accountability. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Bangladesh.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Bangladesh strongly condemns the attack on the Shajare Tayyaba Girls' School in Minab in Iran, resulting in the tragic killing of 168 innocent children. This egregious attack is a grave and flagrant violation of international humanitarian law. It is a collective moral failure of the global community that indiscriminate attacks on the civilians and civilian sites are continuing. Bangladesh is also deeply concerned over the ongoing escalation of the conflict in the region, which continues to pose a serious threat to the international peace and security and create a broader humanitarian impact. Bangladesh is not immune to the ongoing conflict, which has already resulted in tragic loss of lives of Bangladeshis working in the region and is placing significant strain on the country's energy security and economic stability. Therefore, Bangladesh once again calls for restraint, immediate de-escalation and cessation of hostilities by all parties and underscores that diplomacy and constructive dialogue must be allowed adequate opportunity in finding the just and lasting solution of the crisis. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Uruguay.
Señor presidente, como señaló Uruguay el pasado 25 de marzo, la situación actual provocada por los ataques militares continuos impacta de lleno en la población civil, especialmente en niños, niñas y adolescentes, personas con discapacidad, personas mayores y mujeres. En dicha instancia sostuvimos que poblaciones civiles, hospitales, escuelas, centrales de energía, las que suministran tanto a hospitales como a los sistemas de calefacción y refrigeración, han sido atacadas desconociéndose la protección que los convenios de Ginebra les otorgan. Del mismo modo, hospitales, en su personal sanitario y sus equipamientos, las escuelas, alumnos, alumnas, sus docentes y personal no docente han sido atacados sistemáticamente, generando miles de bajas civiles. Uruguay, como penholder de la resolución sobre los derechos del niño presentada junto a países del GRULAC y la Unión Europea, que este año se refiere a conflictos armados, hace un llamado enérgico a proteger a la niñez y a los sistemas que resultan fundamentales para su vida, como son los educativos, sanitarios, alimentarios y de seguridad. La resolución de la Asamblea General de Naciones Unidas, que proclamó el 9 de septiembre el Día Internacional para Proteger la Educación de Ataques, reitera la necesidad de que se protejan y respeten los establecimientos de enseñanza conforme al derecho internacional humanitario. Uruguay, integrante de la comunidad internacional construida sobre reglas consolidadas, demanda el inicio de la desescalada militar, el cumplimiento de las normas básicas que nos hemos otorgado y el reinicio de las conversaciones diplomáticas. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I call on the distinguished representative of Sierra Leone.
President, we are concerned by the reported aerial attacks on the school in Mina in Iran. Such incidents would raise serious concerns under international humanitarian law and human rights law regarding the protection of civilians and educational institutions. We acknowledge the confirmation by the United States authorities that the incident is under investigation. We welcome recent news of potential ceasefire discussions aimed at resolving the conflict and calls on all parties to pursue dialogue and diplomacy in good faith. De-escalation remains essential to prevent further civilian suffering and restore regional and global stability. As signatory to the Safe School Declaration, we acknowledge the importance of safeguarding students, educators and educational facilities from attacks and military use. Drawing from a post-conflict experience, we stress that protecting children is vital to sustainable peace. Attacks on children and disruption to education cause lasting trauma, displacement, social instability. All parties must respect IHL, international human rights law, and the Charter of the United Nations. We are also concerned about the wider global impact of the conflict. Disruptions to the Strait of Hormuz are affecting energy supply chains, with developing countries, including Sierra Leone, facing fuel shortages, rise in living costs, and economic strain. Continued hostilities keep risking deepening inequality and reversing development gains. And I thank you, President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Oman.
تعرب سلطنة عمان عن قلقها الشديد أزاء التطورات الخطيرة في المنطقة جراء التصعيد العسكري والهجمات المتبادلة المستمرة منذ حوالي شهر، والتي راح ضحيتها المدنيين الأبرياء والحقت أضرارا جسيمة بالمنشآت الحيوية والمرافق العامة في دول مجلس التعاون وإيران، ومثلت تهديدا كبيرا لسيادة الدول وأمنها وسلامة شعوبها. ويعد استهداف المدرسة الابتدائية للطالبات في ميناب من بين أبرز الأحداث المؤسفة التي شهد النزاع الدائر حاليا، إذ تمثل هذه الحادثة انتهاكا للقوانين والمواثيق الدولية وإضرارا بالمساعي العالمية الهادفة إلى توفير الحماية للأطفال والمؤسسات التعليمية في أوقات النزاعات المسلحة. سيد الرئيس، تود سلطنة عمان من هذا المنبر أن تقدم تعازيها لأسر الضحايا وتدعو إلى ضرورة الالتزام بالقوانين والأعراف الدولية، لا سيما القانون الدولي الإنساني، في عدم التعرض للمنشآت المدنية والبنية الأساسية تحت أي مصوغ أو ظرف كان. ختاما، تجدد سلطنة عمان دعوتها إلى ضبط النفس ووقف الأعمال العدائية والالتزام بالقانون الدولي، كما تدعم جهود المجتمع الدولي الحثيثة الساعية إلى وقف فوري للحرب واحتواء تداعياتها، وتشجيع العودة إلى مسار الدبلوماسية والحوار باعتبارها النهج الوحيد الذي يحقق مصالح الجميع ويكفل التفادي للانزلاق نحو ما لا يحمد عقباه ويعيد الأمن والاستقرار المنشودين إلى المنطقة. شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Belarus.
Спасибо, господин председатель. Поддерживаем инициативу Ирана, Китая и Кубы провести срочные дебаты СПЧ, связанные с вероломной атакой на Иран и ударами по образовательным учреждениям, а также другим гражданским объектам, повлекшим массовые жертвы среди мирного населения, особенно детей. Невозможно смириться с гибелью детей. особенно когда это можно и нужно было избежать, продолжая вести дипломатические переговоры, в которых Иран участвовал в духе доброй воли. Важно, чтобы система ООН, включая ее правозащитное направление, не остановилась на заявлениях и выражениях обеспокоенности, а дала соответствующую оценку происходящим нарушениям международного права, международного гуманитарного права и прав человека, которые совершаются в Иране из-за ударов по школам, больницам и критической гражданской инфраструктуре. Большую тревогу вызывает уничтожение энергетических объектов, повлекшее экологическую катастрофу в Тегеране и угрозу здоровью миллионов людей. Осуществление угроз в отношении ядерной энергостанции Ирана станет непоправимой трагедией далеко за пределами страны. Выражаем надежду на скорейшее прекращение вооруженного противостояния и установление мира, в котором остро нуждается все население региона. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Venezuela.
Gracias, presidente. Venezuela condena y rechaza enérgicamente el asesinato de 168 niñas y niños en la escuela primaria de Minab, en la República Islámica de Irán, el pasado 28 de febrero. Venezuela expresa sus más sinceras condolencias al pueblo y al gobierno iraní. Lamentablemente nos encontramos ante una grave violación del derecho internacional humanitario y de la Carta de las Naciones Unidas, y por ello saludamos la decisión de este Consejo de debatir de manera urgente esta situación a solicitud de Irán, China y Cuba. No existe argumento alguno que justifique el ataque deliberado contra una escuela. Este acto es una afrenta directa contra los derechos humanos del pueblo iraní y de la humanidad. Son inaceptables los ataques contra objetivos civiles. No puede haber impunidad ante esta atrocidad. Debe haber rendición de cuentas. Este Consejo no puede permitirse repetir la inacción y el doble rasero observado en el genocidio palestino. Señor presidente, teniendo en cuenta las causas reales del conflicto en curso que afecta a toda la región y amenaza la paz y la seguridad internacionales, consideramos que debe prevalecer el diálogo y el respeto al derecho internacional, no solo como una obligación legal para garantizar la paz, sino como la única forma legítima de honrar la memoria de las niñas y los niños asesinados en la escuela de Minab. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of New Zealand.
Mr. President, the strike on the Shajaria Tayyaba Girls' School in Minab, Iran, in this conflict is an absolute tragedy. We welcome the US decision that it will independently investigate what happened and release the results. This is an essential step forward toward accountability. The protection of children in peacetime and in conflict must remain a top priority for the international community. Children should not and must not be made to bear the cost of this conflict. New Zealand is deeply alarmed by the devastating impacts of this conflict on civilians. We call on all parties to the conflict to uphold their obligations under international humanitarian law, including to protect civilians and civilian objects, including schools. We implore all states to take urgent action to protect children, uphold international law, and prevent further loss of life. Human rights must be upheld and protected at all times. We urge the parties to engage in negotiations to reach an immediate cessation of hostilities and a diplomatic solution to the conflict. The longer this conflict goes on, the more severe the human impacts for all. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Malaysia.
Mr. President, Malaysia is deeply concerned about the escalation of hostilities and rising casualties in the Middle East. We unequivocally condemn the devastating airstrike on an elementary girls' school in Minab, which occurred on day one of this regional conflict. This callous attack on a civilian infrastructure claiming 168 lives, mostly young children, constitutes a gross violation of international law. Every child's life lost must shock our conscience. We cannot allow ourselves to become numb to their deaths. The destruction of educational spaces in situations of armed conflict deprives children of safety, learning, and hope. Mr. President, Malaysia emphasizes that all violations must be subject to prompt, independent, and credible investigations to ensure accountability. Malaysia calls on all parties to fully comply with their obligations under international humanitarian and human rights laws, including the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution. Malaysia reiterates the urgent need for immediate de-escalation, cessation of hostilities, and a return to dialogue. Any sustainable resolution must be grounded in the rule of law and address the root causes of the conflict. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Finland.
Mr. President, Finland aligns with the EU statement. We are deeply alarmed by the loss of civilian life and tremendous suffering of civilians, including children, caused by the hostilities in the whole region. Attacks on schools, hospitals and other civilian infrastructure are completely unacceptable. Governments are required to take all measures to ensure that children's rights are fully respected also in armed conflicts. The Safe Schools Declaration provides useful tools as regards protecting the right to education during conflict. Finland calls for de-escalation and maximum restraint, the protection of civilians and civilian objects, including civilian infrastructure, and full respect of international law by all parties, including the UN Charter, international humanitarian law, and international human rights law. Finland also calls for the respect of the universal human rights and fundamental freedoms of the Iranian people, including the right to choose their own future. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Philippines.
Mr. President, the Philippines expresses its sincere condolences to the families of the victims over the heartbreaking tragedy in Minab. The attacks that claimed the lives of 168 young school children are an assault on our shared humanity. Attacks against children in schools are grave breaches of international humanitarian law and result in serious violations of human rights. For the Philippines, children are zones of peace. As a member of the Global Pathfinding Alliance, the Philippines is firmly committed to advancing children's rights, including in situations of armed conflict. The Philippines will host the second Global Ministerial Conference on Ending Violence Against Children in November this year, with the aim of accelerating global action and enhancing accountability to protect children everywhere from all forms of violence in times of peace and in times of conflict. We call on all states, particularly parties to armed conflict, to fulfill their obligations to safeguard the rights, dignity, and safety of children at all times. Avoidable tragedies involving children must never be repeated nor normalized. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Canada.
Mr. President, we are shocked and profoundly distressed by the tragic deaths of 168 school children in Minab, Iran. Violence affecting children's schools or other civilian objects violates international humanitarian law and constitutes a grave violation against children in armed conflict, causing devastating impacts on their lives and well-being. Iranians are bearing an immense human cost in this war. Families are losing loved ones, and many face daily threats of attacks, raising living costs, and critical shortages of basic goods such as food, water, and energy. We implore all parties to comply with international humanitarian law, including the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution in order to protect civilians and civilian objects. Canada supports an independent, impartial, and transparent investigation into the incident in Minab, accountability and redress for the victims, and the endorsement and implementation of the Safe Schools Declaration. As the toll on civilians rises, we urge all parties to de-escalate tensions, prioritize pathways for diplomacy, and ensure the protection of civilians. We mourn with the families affected by this unacceptable loss of life. All children have the right to education and must live and learn free from violence, including strikes. We extend our sincere sympathies to the families and loved ones of these school children. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. Israel's military attack on the Islamic Republic of Iran, launched under the U.S. active support and patronage, and the military action of the U.S., which joined in it, are an illegal act of aggression and the most despicable form of violation of sovereignty in their nature from A to Z. The DPRK delegation condemns in the strongest tone the shameless rogue act of the U.S. and Israel, which put their domestic law before the recognized international law, and do not hesitate to abuse military muscle in order to realize their selfish and hegemonic ambition. The tyranny's high-handed and arbitrary practices make those countries directly related to the regional situation pay due price, and give rise to the concern that they may have a negative effect which cannot be disregarded politically, economically, and geopolitically on the region, which has no connection with the present Iranian situation. The unjustifiable war of aggression by the U.S. and Israel can never be tolerated in any case. The relevant and interested parties in the region would be well advised to fulfill their due responsibilities in switching the trend in the situation of the Middle East back to peace and stability. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Germany.
Thank you, Mr. President. We align ourselves with the EU statement. Germany deeply deplores the loss of life of innocent civilians. Our delegation's thoughts are with the victims and their families. We reiterate our call for de-escalation and maximum restraint. The protection of all civilians and civilian infrastructure, including children, is also reflected in the Safe Schools Declaration in this armed conflict, and for the full respect of international law and international humanitarian law. Germany urges Iran to finally provide full and unhindered access to the mandates created by this Council to ensure that any allegations of violations of international humanitarian law can be independently investigated. In closing, let me reiterate our call for an end of the appalling violence and repression by Iran against its own people. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Turkey.
Thank you, Mr. President. We are deeply concerned with the escalation of hostilities in our region. An immediate ceasefire is needed to avoid further devastation. We will continue to make every effort to secure a ceasefire and restore stability in the region. Turkey condemns any action that violates international law, endangers the lives of innocent people, and targets civilian infrastructure. Schools, hospitals, places of worship, and water sources should not be targeted. The attack on the school in Minab is a violation of international humanitarian law and should not be repeated. Civilians must be protected at all times and under all circumstances. The fact that those killed were children makes the situation even more grave. We have to do everything in our power to prevent such killings. In line with the Convention on the Rights of the Child, we consider it essential to safeguard the rights to life, survival and development of every child, and call on all parties to take all necessary measures to ensure this. As we mentioned before under this roof, the region needs a comprehensive formula for peace that will replace long decades of instability. Turkey will continue to spare no efforts to end hostilities and build a lasting peace in our region. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Sri Lanka.
Mr. President, Sri Lanka remains deeply concerned with the evolving situation in West Asia and its implications for regional stability and global security. We are deeply saddened by the strike on Shajare-Tayeb Girls' School in Minab, resulting in the tragic loss of life of 168 school children and injury to many. This tragedy brings to light the devastating consequences of the conflict, which must be avoided at all costs. Mr. President, Sri Lanka reiterates that respect for international law, including the principles of the UN Charter, remain critical in addressing the ongoing situation in the region. We urge all parties involved to ensure strict adherence to the relevant conventions and declarations and to prioritize the protection of civilian life, in particular of children, women, the elderly and persons with disabilities, as well as of critical infrastructure including schools, hospitals and medical and energy facilities. We call upon all parties to exercise maximum restraint and take all necessary measures for the immediate de-escalation of the situation. We emphasize the importance of diplomacy and dialogue to bring about lasting peace, stability and security in the region. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Greece.
Thank you, Mr. President. Greece aligns with the EU statement. Greece is closely following the situation in Iran and the broader region with serious concern. We regret the continued loss of civilian lives, particularly children, and stress that the protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure must remain a priority. Compliance with international law, including international humanitarian law and international human rights law, is essential. Greece is deeply concerned about the tragic attack on a school in Minab on 28 February, which resulted in the loss of children's lives. Our thoughts and deepest condolences are with the families. Children are entitled to special protection at all times, including during armed conflict. Schools and other facilities dedicated to civilian use must be safeguarded, and all parties should take concrete steps to avoid harm to children and ensure their rights are fully respected. Incidents affecting educational institutions are particularly concerning. We call on all parties to exercise restraint and avoid further escalation, which would undermine regional stability and international security. Only dialogue, diplomacy and engagement can help reduce tensions and create the conditions for a lasting negotiated solution. We support diplomatic efforts aimed at de-escalation and the protection of human rights in the region. We reiterate our call for the respect of human rights and fundamental freedoms of the Iranian people and recognize the valuable role of international monitoring mechanisms addressing the human rights situation in Iran and support their continued work, which contributes to accountability and transparency. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Portugal.
Mr. President, Portugal aligns with the statement delivered by the European Union. We call on all parties to exercise maximum restraint and to swiftly return to political and diplomatic solutions. We express our condolences to the victims and mourn the loss of life and the suffering caused to all affected. International law, including international human rights law and international humanitarian law, must be respected. The principles of distinction, proportionality and precaution are non-derogable obligations. Civilians, and especially children, must never be the target of military attacks. Schools must remain safe environments where children can learn and develop free from fear or violence. Portugal stands ready to support all efforts towards ending hostilities and reaching a lasting peace. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Austria.
Mr. President, Austria aligns itself with the EU statement and recalls its national statement made at the urgent debate called by GCC and Jordan. We reiterate that diplomacy remains the only viable path forward and urge all parties to pursue de-escalation without delay. In line with the Convention of the Rights of the Child, the Safe Schools Declaration, the Children and Armed Conflict Framework, as well as the Political Declaration on Explosive Weapons in Populated Areas, Austria calls on all parties to 1. Strictly adhere to the principles of distinction, proportionality and precaution under international humanitarian law. 2. Ensure that schools, hospitals and other civilian facilities are never targeted or used for military purposes. 3. Conduct independent, transparent and impartial investigations into attacks on civilian infrastructure. And 4. Restrict or refrain from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, taking all feasible precautions to protect civilians and civilian infrastructure, including the essential services for children to survive and avoid civilian harm. Austria will continue to devote particular attention to the protection of civilians, particularly children, affected by armed conflict and in post-conflict situations. Finally, we reiterate our support for the work of the fact-finding mission and the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Iran. I thank you.
Thank you. Excellencies, distinguished participants, that was the last speaker on the list, and we shall now turn to the list of speakers for national human rights institutions and non-governmental organizations, and I give the floor to the representative of MAT for Peace, Development and Human Rights Association for a video intervention.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. تشكر مؤسسة معت المجلس على عقد هذا النقاش الطارئ الثاني خلال الدورة 61، وتجدد مؤسسة معت إدانتها للقصف الجوي والهجمات العشوائية على المؤسسات التعليمية سواء في إيران أو دول مجلس التعاون الخليجي. إن هذه الحرب والتحركات العسكرية الأمريكية الأخيرة خاصة قرب جزيرة خرج تجعل الشرق الأوسط قابل للانفجار في أي وقت، وتهدد بمحو أجيال من الشباب والأطفال كتب عليهم تحمل أخطاء لم يفعلوها، وهي نتيجة لأطماع القادة السياسيين والعسكريين وشركات بيع السلاح. سيد الرئيس، لدى مؤسسة معت مخاوف من أن تؤدي هذه الحرب التي بدأتها الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية وأدت إلى مقتل مئات الأطفال في إيران ولبنان، أن تخلق أجيالا من الأطفال غير واثقين في المؤسسات الدولية، أجيال لا تعترف إلا بمبدأ الثأر. لذلك تطالب مؤسسة معت بالضغط على الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية وسلطة الاحتلال الإسرائيلي وإيران لإنهاء العمليات العسكرية ووقف أي استهداف للمدارس والأعيان المدنية، والمشاركة بحسن نية في مفاوضات لوقف إطلاق النار لتحقيق السلام والتعايش السلمي بين الجميع في الشرق الأوسط. شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you. I give the floor to the representative of the Association Maona for Human Rights and Immigration.
Thank you. Over the last year, attacks on schools in conflict zones around the world have increased by 44%, affecting millions of children. Students and teachers as civilians and schools as civilian objects are protected under international humanitarian law. Attacking them is a war crime and a grave violation against children. We strongly condemn any attacks on schools. We also want to highlight that over the past few decades, Iran, through its militias, has been responsible for attacks on schools in Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. In Syria, more than 7,000 schools were destroyed. In Iraq, even back in 1987, an Iranian missile hit a Bilad al-Shuhada school during the morning assembly, killing and injuring more than 200 students. After 2003, Iran was responsible for the assassination campaign of more than 500 Iraqi academies. In Yemen, the Iranian-backed Houthis, since their emergence in 2011, have targeted and destroyed the whole education system. They turned schools and universities into military training facilities, interrupting studies to recruit future fighters among students. It resulted in thousands of child soldiers and millions of children out of school. School bombardments stripped away their right to education and hope for a better future. Therefore, Association Maona and Geneva International Center for Justice call for accountability for all perpetrators of school attacks. No one is above the law. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the representative of Iran Human Rights Documentation Center.
Mr. President, the Iran Human Rights Documentation Center addresses this council with profound concern over the attacks at the Shahjar-e-Tayyib Girls' School in Minab, an incident that violates the fundamental protection owed to children and educational institutions under international law. We stress the importance of the independent inquiries conducted by the fact-finding mission on Iran and the Special Rapporteur, which must be fully resourced, granted unfettered access to the country, and provided full cooperation by all parties. International law is clear. All children must have their rights protected and upheld at all times, in times of conflict, in times of civil unrest, and in times of peace. We urge this body to remember the 236 children reportedly killed by the Iranian government just this January, as protests were violently repressed. Recall that in the Woman Life Freedom Movement of 2022, girls' schools across Iran were subjected to raids by security forces. Today, Iranian civilians, including school children and minors, face dual risks, both large-scale external military operations and deliberate repression by their own authorities, heightening the risk of perpetration of atrocity crimes. The Iranian government continues to restrict the country's internet access, preventing civilians from receiving warnings or taking measures for physical protection from strikes. This access must be restored immediately. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the representative of Human Rights Watch.
Mr. President, Human Rights Watch is alarmed by attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure across the conflict, including schools and hospitals, and other harms to children, including as a result of mass displacement. The devastating, unlawful attack on a primary school in Minab that reportedly killed scores of civilians, including many children, should be investigated as a war crime by the US. All parties have an obligation to take all feasible precautions to avoid civilian harm. In addition to potential war crimes in the wider conflict, Iranian authorities continue to commit grave crimes against their own people, including children. The Special Rapporteur reported how protesters, including children, have been shot at close range or severely beaten by security forces amid the crackdown since January. The FFM has warned repression is likely to worsen amid the conflict. Those responsible for countrywide massacres in January have made credible threats to repeat them. The commander of police has threatened that security forces are ready to shoot and that people taking to the streets will be treated as the enemy, while the IRGC has warned of a harsher blow than January. Unlawful restrictions on communications and internet shutdown continue, putting all civilians at further risk amid the conflict. Mr. President, we are concerned by the fragmented and selective approach of this Council to the conflict. Every child in Iran, in Lebanon and beyond has the right to live free from fear, their rights and lives protected. There can be no room for double standards on international law. We again urge states to ensure a comprehensive, impartial approach to all violations by all parties, recognising the rights of all victims without discrimination. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the United Nations Watch.
Mr. President, what happened at the Minab Girls' School, located next to an IRGC military base, is a tragedy. We welcome the U.S. decision to open an investigation by an officer independent of CENTCOM. Responsible democracies must hold themselves to account. But let us be clear. If anything, this incident was an exception that proves the rule. The United States has now conducted 10,000 strikes targeting IRGC weapons and military assets, not civilians. That's how they destroyed vast amounts of IRGC missile, drone, and naval capabilities. By contrast, from Dubai to Tel Aviv, the Islamic Republic of Iran is deliberately targeting homes, playgrounds, hospitals, not by accident, but by design. In Israel, the casualty rate from Iranian attacks is 100% civilian. Distinguished delegates, there is a clear difference between inadvertently killing civilians during war, a tragedy that occurs in every conflict, and targeting civilians as a policy. Those who blur this moral distinction betray the very meaning of humanitarian law, because those who target civilians have a name: terrorists. That is why the EU officially designated the Islamic Revolutionary Guards by that name: terrorists. To the IRGC, we say, you do not represent the Iranian people. No, they consider you occupiers of their country. History's verdict is already written for those who murder thousands of their own people and who target hospitals and playgrounds and call it resistance. The IRGC has chosen the path of shame. I urge the civilized world, choose the path of honor. Stand with the Iranian people.
Thank you. I give the floor to the representative of ARC for video intervention.
Monsieur le Président, le fait qu'un État appelle à la protection des enfants dans le conflit armé tout en étant impliqué dans de graves violations à leur encontre suscite de profondes préoccupations. Les 7 et 8 janvier, plus de 200 enfants de moins de 18 ans ont été tués par des forces de sécurité lors de manifestations et plusieurs ont été détenus dans des prisons. Les écoliers tués à Minab, comme tous les enfants victimes de conflits, ne sont ni responsables des décisions politiques ni acteurs des hostilités. Ils demeurent les premières victimes de la situation qu'ils ne contrôlent pas. Depuis des années, certains politiques ont exposé la population iranienne à des risques accrus. Des violations graves ont été documentées, notamment l'usage, l'état de la force contre les manifestants pacifiques. Des informations concordantes indiquent également la présence d'installations militaires à proximité des zones civiles, y compris des écoles et des quartiers résidentiels. De telles pratiques constituent une violation grave du droit international humanitaire. Nous, associations ARC et Centres Zacros pour les droits de l'homme, demandons la tenue d'une enquête internationale indépendante et impartiale pour documenter le fait. La protection des enfants exige vérité, justice et fin d'impunité. Merci.
Thank you. I give the floor to the representative of IPWR.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Mr. President, the Institute for Protection of Women's Rights, while thanking Council for convening this urgent meeting, draws the Council's attention to one of the most unprecedented war crimes in recent history. Despite establishing humanitarian and human rights protections for children in armed conflicts, the occupying powers of Israel and the United States, disregarding all international laws, targeted Iranian students with more than 200 children killed to date. In the early hours of these attacks, the Shajariyeh Tayyib Elementary School in Minab was brutally struck, killing 165 innocent children in their classrooms. Targeting children in what should be the safest environment for their growth and education demonstrates the perpetrator's absolute disregard for human dignity and international law. The schools as civilian objects enjoy special protection under international humanitarian law, and attacks against them may constitute war crimes. As a member of Iran's civil society, we strongly condemn the deliberate bombing of the school, and we stress that children, teachers, and schools must never be military targets. We believe that all capacities and human rights mandates must be used to take immediate action for the criminal prosecution of the perpetrators of these atrocities. The silence and inaction of international human rights mechanisms and the resulting impunity will only reinforce this cycle and undermine the credibility of United Nations human rights institutions. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the representative of the Organization for Defending Victims of Violence for a video intervention.
Mr. President, we are witnessing a total collapse of global morality. The aerial bombardment of Shajariyeh Tayyib Girls' School in Minab is not merely a breach of international humanitarian law. It is a testament to the horrifying impunity championed by the Israel and shielded by the United States. How can we expect Washington officials who are tied to their own scandals of sexual abuse to care about children in Iran? From the dark corners of their scandals to the open slaughter of girls aged 7 to 12 in their classrooms, they have no moral grounds left to stand on. We must ask, where are the lives we were supposed to protect? These are not just numbers, they are Fatemeh, Zahra, Maryam, Athare, and Hannane, and many other names. The girls of Minab were Iran's tomorrow. Today, their desks are empty, and their lessons remain unfinished. As these innocent souls ascend, the international community must find its voice. We cannot let double standard bury the future of a nation. We urge a meaningful investigation. The blood of the girls in Minab requires more than words. It requires enforcement of international law against both the perpetrators and those who provide the military means for such atrocities. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the representative of the International Commission of Jurists.
The ICJ condemns the unlawful attack on the primary school in Minab. Direct attacks against civilians and objects are strictly prohibited, as is the failure to take precautions to protect civilians and civilian objects. The strike must be investigated as a potential war crime. This attack is a part of a pattern of unlawful attacks against civilian objects by the parties to the conflict. The ICJ reiterates its call on all parties to the ongoing conflict to adhere to international law, including the principles of distinction, precaution, and proportionality. The ICJ also reiterates its call on this Council to condemn and address all violations and abuses of human rights and violations of international humanitarian law committed by all parties to this conflict. Maintaining the integrity and credibility of this Council requires no less. As stressed by the chair of the FFN on Iran, Iranian people are caught between a large-scale military campaign by two countries, the US and Israel, and ongoing repression by their own government in Iran. In this context, it is of utmost importance that all relevant HRC mechanisms, including the FFM and the Special Rapporteur on Iran, are able to pursue their critical work to document human rights violations and abuses committed in Iran, especially those amounting to crimes under international law, with the view to contribute to accountability for such crimes, and states must cooperate fully with these mechanisms. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the representative of Association of Iranian Short-Statured Adults for a video intervention.
Mr. President, we cannot allow the mass killing of children to be normalized, nor buried beneath reports, statements, and expressions of grave concerns. What is required today is action and accountability. In Minab, 168 children were killed in a war crime carried out by U.S.-Israeli forces. The targeting of these children was part of a broader pattern of systematically abandoning legal obligations by the United States, continuing on its impunity to do so. One cannot expect humanitarian concerns for Iranian children from those whose pasts are shadowed by allegations of child exploitations, and such systematic cruelty is the hallmark of a war criminal. Any credible investigation must be independent and must center evidence and testimony from within Iran, by Iranians, and for the victims. Families have the right not only to the truth, but to dignity, to be heard and to be believed. What we're witnessing is not an isolated war crime. From Minab to Gaza, there is a pattern: the normalization of attacks on schools, the erosion of civilian protection, and the dehumanization of children. The post-Second World War legal order is collapsing before our eyes. The children of Shajareh Tayyibeh were the future of a nation. If this continues with impunity, then no child anywhere will ever be safe.
Thank you. I give the floor to the representative of Maloka International.
La protección de la infancia y de las instituciones educativas en contexto de conflicto armado no es una opción política, es una opción del DIH, es una obligación del DIH y de los derechos humanos. El ataque contra la escuela de Minab constituye una grave violación de estos principios fundamentales. Los convenios de Ginebra y sus protocolos adicionales son claros. Los bienes de carácter civil, en particular las escuelas, gozan de protección especial. Atacarlos no solo vulnera el principio de distinción, sino que erosiona los fundamentos mismos del orden jurídico internacional. Este Consejo no puede limitarse a una aislada sin examinar el contexto mucho más amplio. La región atraviesa una escalada que no surge en el vacío. El derecho internacional reconoce el derecho inherente a la legítima defensa conforme al artículo 51 de la Carta, así como la obligación de los Estados de no permitir que su territorio sea utilizado para actos contra terceros. Nos preocupa la tendencia a aplicar el derecho internacional de manera selectiva. Cuando ciertos actores recurren a la fuerza, se invocan narrativas de seguridad, cuando otros responden, se les somete a condenas inmediatas. Este doble rasero debilita la credibilidad del sistema multilateral. La protección de los niños no puede instrumentalizarse en disputas geopolíticas. Exige coherencia, responsabilidad de los actores y el respeto igualitario del derecho internacional. Muchas gracias, presidente.
Thank you. I give the floor to the representative of Iman Ali's Popular Student Relief Society for a video intervention.
Thank you, Mr. President. In the midst of war, the protection of children must remain a duty for all parties. Over 100 schoolboys and girls were killed in the attack on the Shajareh Tayyibeh school, and at least 100 other children across the country. Independent verification remains impossible due to the shutdown of the internet and the denial of access to the SR and the FFM on Iran. In violation of the CRC, an official of the IRGC in Tehran publicly stated that the Basij had recruited children as young as 12 for operational roles, including checkpoint inspections across Tehran. Children may pose serious risks to civilians during checkpoint inspections. At the same time, given that such checkpoints have reportedly been targeted in Israeli and US attacks, they are exposed to lethal danger. All parties to the conflict must respect the basic rights and safety of children. Their deaths cannot be dismissed as mere collateral damage. The USA and Israel bear responsibility to provide full reparation for unlawful harm caused to civilians, particularly children, including compensation to victims' families. They are also responsible for compensating damage to civilian infrastructure. Such reparation should be directed to a legitimate government elected through a free and fair process by the people of Iran. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the representative of Medical Support Association for Underprivileged Iranian Patients for video intervention.
Mr. President, we were still grieving the loss of people in the 12-day aggression when the US and Israel brutally attacked Iran, starting with an elementary school in Minab, killing 168 children in 2 intentional horrific attacks. Girls gathered downstairs, sheltering from the first attack, when a second missile ended their short life stories. Their last moments make it needless to ask the international community to unequivocally condemn the inhuman US and Israel attack on the school. Such an assault on an educational institution where children are entitled to safety, learning, and dignity constitutes a flagrant violation of international law and a vivid war crime. Under international humanitarian law, schools are protected, and parties to any armed conflict must uphold the principles of distinction, which US and Israel have no respect for. Intentional attack against children or educational facilities constitute a grave breach of international law. We urge the Council to establish an investigation mechanism to collect all documents relevant to this US-Israel atrocity and ensure accountability for the perpetrators. Unfortunately, human rights have become a matter of double standards in this upside-down world we are living in. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the representative of Eliska Relief Foundation. Not here. I give the floor to the representative of Human Rights Research League for a video intervention.
Thank you, Mr. President. Human Rights Research League is deeply concerned about the human toll of the ongoing armed conflict, and particularly the civilian casualties it causes. We emphasize that all sides need to observe international law, also and especially in situations of armed conflict, and international humanitarian law is clear on this. It strictly forbids direct attacks on civilians and requests all parties to abide by the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution to minimize civilian suffering. Where children are hit in an attack, one or several of these principles have clearly not been sufficiently observed. We are also gravely concerned about the lives of political prisoners in Iran. According to humanitarian law, civilian detainees are to be protected from violence to life and person at any time. No one should be imprisoned for his political beliefs to begin with. But political prisoners are also in double jeopardy. They are considered enemies of the state and were subjected to torture and deprivation even before the war started. And during the recent bombings of Iran, reports indicate that prison guards had left their posts, bringing themselves to safety while leaving the prisoners locked in and without shelter. Human Rights Research League implores this council to ensure all sides observe humanitarian law and pressure the government of Iran to release all political prisoners and ensure their safety. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the representative of Amnesty International.
Indicates that the school in Minab was directly struck by U.S. forces with guided weapons, pointing to a failure to take feasible precautions to avoid civilian harm. U.S. authorities must ensure impartial, independent, and transparent investigations. Where sufficient evidence exists, competent authorities should prosecute any person suspected of criminal responsibility. In the aftermath of the attack, Iranian authorities have exploited the suffering of victims' families and survivors for propaganda purposes. Iranian forces have also carried out unlawful attacks against Israel and Gulf countries that have caused civilian harm, and Israel has carried out unlawful attacks in Iran and in Lebanon. We reiterate our urgent call for all parties in authorities threaten further mass killings of dissidents and protesters amid an ongoing internet shutdown they imposed. Prisoners and individuals detained in security facilities, including the thousands of arbitrarily detained protesters and other dissidents, are endangered, both by strikes by the United States and Israel and also by the Iranian authorities, who continue to forcibly disappear, torture, and arbitrarily execute prisoners as bombs fall. This Council must insist that respect for international law and tackling impunity be the centerpiece of any genuine political resolution, with holistic accountability efforts driven by the gravity of the harms done rather than politics. This Council must champion a comprehensive and sustained strategy leveraging all tools and mandates available, including the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, treaty bodies, and the Human Rights Council mandates and processes. Thank you.
Thank you. I noted the technical glitch, and I request the Secretariat to ensure that it does not recur. And I now give the floor to the representative of Civicus World Alliance for Citizen Participation.
Mr. President, Civicus is gravely concerned about the unfolding situation in Iran and the Gulf region. The conflict is exacerbating the already closed civic space in Iran. We firmly condemn the indiscriminate attacks and targeting civilians, including children. The aerial attacks on school and civilian infrastructure constitute a grave breach of international humanitarian and human rights law. We urge a full and transparent investigation into all such instances to ensure justice for all victims. Following the US and Israel's aggression in breach of international law towards Iran and amid Iran's retaliation, the conflict has caused immense loss of life in addition to threatening further deterioration of fundamental freedoms in the region. The coordinated airstrikes by Israel and the US have killed at least 1,255 people in Iran, injuring about 10,000 according to official data. Serious concerns remain over the safety of protest detainees, forcibly disappeared protesters and imprisoned activists in Iran. Following the recent mass protests, many protesters are now facing the death sentence. We urge this Council to take measures to protect and ensure the safety of detained activists, journalists and protesters caught inside active conflict zone, and to address human rights implications of the attacks objectively, impartially and without double standards. We urge all parties to respect the Iranian people's fundamental civic freedoms, hold hostilities and protect civilians, especially vulnerable groups, while the international community works toward a sustainable peace process. We thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the representative of International Association of Justice Watch by video.
In the name of God, Madam President and distinguished members of the Human Rights Council, the Justice Watch Association in this urgent session today asks a very simple but decisive question. If an attack on a school does not provoke an immediate response from this council, then what will? The attack on a school in Minab carried out during the military operations of the United States and Israel is not merely a tragic incident. It is a test of the credibility of the international system for the protection of civilians. A school is a place for learning, not a battlefield. A child is entitled to protection, not to be a target. And if these basic principles collapse, what is at stake is not just a city or a country, but the very integrity of the international law. We warn that leaving an attack on a school unanswered sends a dangerous message to the world that even children are no longer protected. So we hereby call upon the Human Rights Council to unequivocally and formally condemn this attack, immediately establish an independent fact-finding mechanism in cooperation with Iranian NGOs holding consultative status as eyewitnesses, and hold those who ordered, carried out, and supported this attack accountable, leveraging the capacity of organizations with consultative status. Minab must become the point at which the world moves beyond silence. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the representative of Rajasthan, Samgras Kalyan Santan, for a video intervention.
Thank you, Mr. President. Armed conflict does not end when guns fall silent, especially for children. In 2024, a staggering 520 million children, 1 in 5 globally, live in active conflict zones. These children are not merely survivors. They are right holders entitled to justice, healing, and a future. Recovery is not optional. It is an obligation under international law. Yet, fewer than 30% of child survivors in conflict receive adequate psychological or social integration support. Evidence shows that community-based psychological care, access to education, family reunification, and livelihood support significantly reduce re-recruitment and intergenerational violence. We must move beyond rhetoric to systematic action. We urge all states to invest in gender and age-sensitive integration programs, ensuring every child formerly associated with armed groups is recognized first as a victim. Establish accessible, child-friendly justice mechanisms that prioritize restorative practices over retribution. Guarantee meaningful child participation in designing and monitoring recovery processes because policies about children must include children. Mr. President, accountability is prevention. Without reparations, recovery remains incomplete. Let us transform today's discussions into tomorrow's protections. Every child deserves a childhood, not a conflict zone. We thank you. May all live happily.
Thank you. I give the floor.
Or more, persons that could bring an essential contribution to the future and the well-being of mankind. Killing is to a large extent self-destructive. Full respect for human life is the path ahead. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. This was the last speaker we could accommodate at this meeting. And this brings us to the end of this urgent debate. Excellencies, distinguished participants, we will now take a short technical break and then proceed with the presentation of reports and the general debate under the agenda item 10. Thank you.